There was a winter night in 1913 when Carl Jung made a decision that would terrify most men into submission. He was 38 years old, successful psychiatrist, married with children, respected colleague of Sigmund Freud. Everything society defines as a complete life, but something inside him was screaming. That night, Jung locked himself in his study, took out his journal and wrote words that would change psychology forever. I shall do the unthinkable. I shall descend into my own depths alone, no matter the cost, no matter the madness, no matter what I lose in the process. For the next 6 years, Jung withdrew from normal social life as much as possible, spending hours each day in what he called active imagination, confronting the darkest territories of his own psyche without guides, without safety nets, without anyone to pull him back if he went too far. His colleagues thought he was losing his mind. His wife worried he'd never return to normal. Society whispered that success had broken him. But Jung emerged from that voluntary isolation transformed, carrying insights that would illuminate human consciousness for the next century. He had discovered something that civilization desperately tries to hide from men. Solitude isn't the absence of strength. It's the forge where real strength is created. But here's what they never told you about Jung's journey into isolation. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't peaceful. It wasn't the sanitized version of self-discovery you see in Instagram posts about finding yourself. Jung confronted what he termed the collective unconscious, facing archetypes and shadow elements so terrifying that he kept a gun in his desk drawer, afraid he might not survive the psychological descent. He experienced visions that would hospitalize most people, heard voices that seemed to come from dimensions beyond normal consciousness, felt his identity dissolve and reconstitute repeatedly, and he did it alone. Not because he was antisocial, not because he couldn't connect with people, but because he understood something profound. The transformation that forges genuine strength cannot happen in a crowd. Your deepest power cannot emerge while you're managing other people's emotional reactions to your growth. Your authentic self cannot be born while you're maintaining the persona that keeps others comfortable. There's a systematic conspiracy running through modern civilization, and it targets masculine solitude with surgical precision. Every message, every romantic comedy, every social expectation, every worried question from family, all carefully designed to convince you that being alone is a problem requiring immediate solution. But what if they're lying? What if the very thing they've taught you to fear and medicate and escape from is actually the crucible where your greatest power waits to be discovered? Here's the question that will change everything. What if I told you that society doesn't want you to embrace solitude because they care about your happiness, but because men who spend significant time alone become impossible to control? Carl Jung spent his entire career studying what makes men genuinely strong versus what makes them appear strong while remaining internally weak. And what he discovered was so threatening to social control mechanisms that most of his work on masculine solitude remains buried in academic journals, discussed in hushed tones, kept away from mainstream awareness. Jung identified 8 specific reasons why solitude transforms men into forces of nature. 8 psychological processes that can only happen in isolation. 8 sources of power that partnership, community, and constant connection actively prevent from developing. Stay with me because what I'm about to reveal will completely invert everything you've been conditioned to believe about strength, connection, and what it takes to become truly dangerous in the best possible sense. The first reason Jung discovered is what he called shadow integration, and it's the most important psychological work a man will ever do. Inside your psyche lives everything you've been taught to suppress, deny, and project onto others. Your rage, your selfishness, your sexual nature, your will to power, your capacity for destruction, all the uncivilized forces that civilization demanded you bury to gain social acceptance. Most men never face their shadow because facing it requires isolation. You cannot integrate what you're ashamed of while surrounded by people whose approval depends on you remaining acceptable, predictable, safe. The shadow work Jung described requires you to lock the door, turn off your phone, and have conversations with parts of yourself that would horrify anyone listening. You must acknowledge desires you've spent your life denying, accept capacities you've pretended don't exist, integrate drives you've been projecting onto others and calling evil. This cannot be done in relationship. Your partner needs you to remain the version of you she fell in love with. Stable, known, manageable. But shadow integration requires you to become temporarily unstable, unknown, dangerous even to yourself. Jung spent those 6 years in isolation conversing with what he called autonomous complexes, aspects of his psyche that had their own agendas, their own voices, their own terrible wisdom. He spoke with figures he named Philemon and Salome, archetypal forces from his unconscious that taught him things his conscious mind could never access. Society would call this psychosis. Jung called it necessary, and he was right. The men who emerge from deep shadow work carry a different quality of presence. They've faced their inner demons and absorbed their power, rather than continuing to fight or flee from them. They've integrated their capacity for destruction, which paradoxically makes them less dangerous because they're conscious of it, in control of it, choosing when and how to deploy it. But this integration only happens in solitude because only in solitude can you be completely honest about what lives inside you. The second reason solitude forges strength is what Jung termed individuation, the process of becoming your true self, rather than society's projection. Most men are walking amalgamations of other people's expectations. Your father's unfulfilled dreams, your mother's fears, your partner's needs, your employer's requirements, society's scripts about what masculinity should look like. You've built an entire identity from borrowed parts, and you call this self. But it's actually a committee, a democracy of influences that has never once consulted the dictator who should be ruling your psyche, your authentic self. Individuation requires you to fire the committee. You must spend significant time alone, in silence without external input, allowing your true nature to emerge from beneath the layers of social conditioning. This is terrifying because you don't know what you'll find. What if your authentic self wants things your constructed self has spent decades denying? What if your real values contradict everything you've built your life around? What if the person you actually are is incompatible with the life you've created? These questions cannot be explored in a coffee shop conversation or processed during couples therapy. They require extended solitude where your persona, the mask you wear for others, can finally drop, and the face beneath can be examined without judgment or immediate need to make it acceptable. Jung observed that most people will do anything to avoid this confrontation. They stay busy, stay connected, stay distracted, because sitting alone with themselves for extended periods reveals uncomfortable truths. But the men who force themselves into this confrontation, who spend days or weeks or months in relative isolation allowing their authentic nature to surface, they discover something extraordinary. The person they actually are is far more powerful than the person they've been pretending to be. Your authentic self has access to energy, creativity, and will that your constructed self can never touch, because constructed selves are designed for social acceptance, not for power. Individuation gives you back your power, but only in solitude can this process complete itself. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city in the comments because I want to know where in the world men are starting to reclaim their solitude and their strength. The third reason Jung identified is the development of what he called the transcendent function, your psyche's ability to synthesize opposites into something new. Inside you right now are contradictions that seem irreconcilable. You want freedom and security, wildness and stability, solitude and connection, creation and destruction. Most men try to choose one side of each paradox and suppress the other, which creates internal civil war, constant psychological tension draining your energy. But Jung discovered that in deep solitude, something miraculous happens. Your psyche begins to generate symbols, dreams, and insights that transcend the either-or thinking that keeps you fragmented. The transcendent function creates a third option that includes both opposites at a higher level of integration. But this function only activates in isolation. Why? Because developing it requires descent into what Jung called the collective unconscious, the deep psychic territory shared by all humanity where archetypes and primordial images live. You cannot access this depth while maintaining surface consciousness required for social interaction. You cannot descend while simultaneously keeping one foot in the everyday world. The journey down demands complete attention, and it happens in solitude or not at all. Jung's own active imagination practice, where he would spend hours dialoguing with unconscious figures, could only happen when he was completely alone. He would visualize descending stone steps into darkness, meeting various archetypal beings, engaging them in conversation, allowing their wisdom to emerge. Try explaining this to your partner over dinner. Try maintaining this practice while managing relationship obligations. It's functionally impossible. The transcendent function requires you to go where others cannot follow, to spend time in psychological spaces that would terrify anyone watching you, to return with integration that cannot be explained, only demonstrated through how you move through the world afterward. Men who develop this function become capable of holding paradox without anxiety, of seeing solutions others can't perceive because they're trapped in binary thinking, of creating entirely new possibilities from seemingly impossible contradictions. But this power is forged exclusively in the fire of extended solitude. The fourth reason is the cultivation of what Jung called the self with a capital S, the archetype of wholeness representing the totality of your conscious and unconscious psyche. Most men identify with their ego, the tiny conscious part of their psyche that handles daily decisions and social navigation. But the ego is maybe 10% of who you actually are. The other 90% operates in the unconscious, influencing your choices, creating your dreams, generating your attractions and repulsions, driving your behavior through patterns you don't recognize. The self is the organizing principle that could integrate all of this into conscious wholeness, but the ego must surrender its illusion of control for the self to emerge. And that surrender requires solitude because it involves a kind of psychological death that looks like madness from the outside. Jung described the emergence of the self as a process where the ego realizes it's not the center of the psyche, just a small satellite orbiting a much larger sun. This realization is humbling and terrifying because the ego likes to think it's in charge. But in deep solitude, through meditation, active imagination, or simply extended time with your own consciousness, you begin to sense the presence of this larger organizing intelligence within you. It speaks through dreams, through synchronicities, through intuitions that bypass rational thought. And gradually, if you're brave enough to listen, the ego learns to serve the self rather than trying to control everything. Men who achieve even partial integration with the self operate from a different source of power. They're not constantly trying to force outcomes because they trust the larger intelligence within them. They're not anxious about control because they've surrendered to something wiser than ego could ever be. They make decisions that seem to come from nowhere, but turn out to be precisely right in ways they couldn't have calculated. But this relationship with the self cannot develop while you're enmeshed in relationship obligations and social demands. The self speaks in whispers and subtle signals, in quiet knowing that gets drowned out by the noise of others' needs and expectations. You must withdraw into silence for extended periods to hear it, to learn its language, to begin trusting its guidance. This is why spiritual traditions across cultures prescribe periods of isolation for those seeking genuine transformation. Vision quests, meditation retreats, hermitage, these aren't escapes from reality, but intensive training programs for developing relationship with the self. The fifth reason solitude creates strength is the forging of what Jung termed psychological sovereignty, the capacity to be your own authority rather than constantly seeking external validation. Most men are approval addicts. They make decisions by committee, checking with partner, friends, family, society to ensure their choices are acceptable. They've outsourced their internal compass to external voices, which means they're constantly vulnerable to manipulation, constantly unstable because their sense of okayness depends on others' reactions. Solitude breaks this addiction brutally. When you spend significant time alone, there's no one to approve or disapprove of your choices. You must develop internal standards, internal validation, internal authority. At first this feels terrifying, like free-falling without a parachute, but gradually something remarkable develops. You start to know what you actually think rather than what you think you should think. You begin to trust your own judgment rather than constantly second-guessing yourself against external standards. You develop what Jung called inner authority, the capacity to be your own parent, your own judge, your own guide. Men with psychological sovereignty move through the world differently. They don't need permission, don't seek approval. don't collapse when criticized. They've developed such strong internal structure that external opinions become interesting data rather than determinants of their worth or direction. But this sovereignty is impossible to develop in constant relationship. Every time you check in with someone about a decision, every time you seek reassurance, every time you modify your behavior based on someone's reaction, you're reinforcing external authority over internal authority. Solitude forces you to stand alone with your choices, to live with consequences without being able to blame or credit anyone else, to develop the internal strength that comes from complete self-reliance. Jung was clear that this doesn't mean isolation forever or rejection of all input, but it does mean that periods of extended solitude, where you practice complete self-authority, are essential for developing the muscle of psychological sovereignty. Without this muscle, you remain a perpetual child, always looking outside yourself for permission to exist, to choose, to be. The sixth reason is the activation of creative power that Jung observed only emerges in isolation. Creativity isn't about making art, though it can include that. It's about accessing the generative forces of the unconscious and channeling them into manifest reality. Every great creation, whether a business, a book, a scientific breakthrough, or a life philosophy, comes from someone who spent significant time alone allowing unconscious material to surface and take form. Jung's own creative output was staggering precisely because he protected his solitude ferociously. His Red Book, his psychological theories, his understanding of archetypes, all emerged from those hours spent alone in active imagination, allowing the unconscious to present its wisdom without the filtering and editing that social consciousness demands. The creative process requires you to descend into chaos, into the unformed primordial material of the unconscious, and bring back something new. But descent into chaos cannot happen while maintaining social persona. You cannot access the wildness within while being civilized. You cannot channel the unconscious while maintaining conscious control. Creativity requires you to go temporarily mad in a controlled way, and you can only do this alone. Partnership, family, social obligations, they all demand you remain stable, predictable, available. But creative emergence demands you become temporarily unstable, unpredictable, unavailable, while something gestates within you. Try explaining to your partner that you need 3 weeks alone to allow a creative vision to emerge. Try maintaining relationship harmony while you're channeling forces from the collective unconscious. The demands are incompatible. This is why so many creators, inventors, artists, and entrepreneurs protect their solitude like it's oxygen. They understand that their greatest work emerges not from collaboration, but from extended periods alone where social consciousness can be suspended and something deeper can surface. Jung observed that men who never allow themselves this creative solitude end up living derivative lives, recycling others' ideas, following safe paths, never accessing the truly original contributions they could make if they were brave enough to descend into their own creative depths. The seventh reason is the development of what Jung called the inferior function, the least developed aspect of your psychological typology. Jung identified that every person has a dominant function, thinking or feeling, sensing or intuiting, that they've developed and rely on. But they also have an inferior function, the opposite of their dominant, that remains undeveloped because it's uncomfortable and requires effort. The inferior function holds tremendous power, because it's the doorway to unconscious material your dominant function cannot access. But developing it requires you to be incompetent for a while, to struggle with ways of processing reality that don't come naturally. And this developmental work can only happen in solitude because it's too vulnerable to do while others are watching. If you're a dominant thinking type, developing your feeling function means allowing yourself to be moved by emotion without immediately analyzing it, to make decisions based on values rather than logic, to prioritize relationship harmony over objective truth sometimes. This feels weak, irrational, wrong to your dominant function. But in solitude, without anyone judging your fumbling attempts, you can practice this new way of being until it begins to integrate. If you're a dominant feeling type, developing your thinking function means learning to prioritize logic over harmony, to make decisions that might hurt feelings but serve truth, to analyze rather than empathize. This feels cold, harsh, disconnected. But alone, you can experiment with this approach without immediately being called insensitive or unfeeling. The inferior function will never develop if you only operate in social contexts, because social contexts reward your dominant function and punish your inferior one. But men who develop all four functions, who integrate thinking and feeling, sensing and intuiting, become psychologically complete in ways that give them capabilities others don't possess. They can think when thinking is needed and feel when feeling serves, sense when concrete data matters, and intuit when vision is required. This completeness translates into enormous flexibility and power. But it can only be forged through extended solitude, where you're free to develop your weak areas without social penalty. The eighth and perhaps most important reason Jung identified is the development of what he called the ability to be alone without loneliness, which is actually a sophisticated psychological achievement that most men never reach. Loneliness is the disease of people who need others to feel complete, who define themselves through external relationships, who collapse into anxiety when social connection is absent. The ability to be alone without loneliness is entirely different. It's the capacity to be fully present with yourself, to enjoy your own company, to feel complete within your own consciousness regardless of whether anyone else is around. Jung observed that most people are terrified of being alone precisely because they've never developed a relationship with themselves. They use constant connection, constant distraction, constant external stimulation to avoid the confrontation with their own consciousness. But in doing so, they remain strangers to themselves, never developing the internal richness that makes solitude pleasurable rather than painful. Men who spend significant time alone are forced to develop this relationship with themselves. At first it's uncomfortable, boring, anxiety-producing, but gradually, if they persist, they discover that their own consciousness is endlessly fascinating, that their own thoughts and dreams and insights are more interesting than most conversation, that being alone is not deprivation, but privilege. This ability transforms everything. A man who is comfortable alone no longer needs relationship for psychological completion. He might choose relationship, but from abundance rather than desperation. He might enjoy company, but he doesn't require it. He moves through the world from a foundation of internal fullness rather than external seeking. And this makes him fundamentally free because nothing and no one can control him through the threat of abandonment or isolation. Jung himself cultivated this capacity deliberately, spending regular time at his tower in Bollingen, where he would go alone for weeks. No electricity, no modern conveniences, just him and his thoughts and his work. He didn't do this because he disliked people, but because he valued his relationship with himself as much as his relationships with others. The modern world is designed to prevent you from ever developing this capacity. Constant connectivity, social media, relationship pressure, fear of missing out, all carefully engineered to keep you externally focused, constantly seeking outside yourself for entertainment, validation, meaning. But every moment you spend in that external seeking is a moment you're not developing internal richness. Every time you reach for your phone instead of sitting with yourself, you're choosing distraction over development. Every time you avoid solitude because it's uncomfortable, you're preventing yourself from accessing the power that only emerges in isolation. Jung's 8 reasons why solitude makes men stronger aren't abstract theories. They're practical realities observable in every man who has been brave enough to embrace extended time alone. Shadow integration, individuation, transcendent function development, relationship with the self, psychological sovereignty, creative power, inferior function development, and the ability to be alone without loneliness. These are not luxuries or optional extras. They are fundamental sources of masculine strength that simply cannot develop in constant connection. You're at a choice point right now. You can continue living in the constant noise, the perpetual connection, the relationship obligations and social expectations that keep you comfortable but weak. Or you can choose the harder path, the one Jung walked, the one that requires you to claim solitude as a sacred practice rather than a problem to be solved. The men who choose this path discover that solitude isn't isolation, It's liberation. It's not loneliness. It's wholeness. It's not escape from life, it's engagement with the deepest dimensions of existence that connection often obscures. Society will tell you that wanting time alone means something is wrong with you, that healthy men are social, connected, in relationship. But Jung's work reveals this is propaganda designed to keep you weak, fragmented, controllable. Strong men, truly strong men, protect their solitude because they understand it's the forge where strength is created, the laboratory where power is discovered, the temple where the self emerges from the chaos of the unconscious. You don't need to become a hermit. Jung didn't. But you do need regular extended periods where you withdraw from external demands, turn off all inputs and spend time alone with your consciousness, allowing the 8 processes Jung identified to do their transformative work. This isn't selfish, it's essential. This isn't antisocial, it's the deepest form of social contribution, because the man who emerges from genuine solitude brings integrated strength to everything he touches. The weak man needs others to feel complete and drains energy from every interaction. The strong man is complete within himself and radiates energy that elevates everyone around him. But that strength cannot be borrowed, cannot be faked, cannot be developed in groups. It must be forged alone in the fire of extended solitude, facing everything within yourself that you've been avoiding, integrating everything you've been projecting, becoming everything you have the potential to be. Jung's message is clear. If you want to become truly strong, you must become comfortable being truly alone. Not forever, not as permanent lifestyle, but as regular practice, as sacred discipline, as the crucible where boys become men and men become forces of nature. The world needs men who have done this work, who carry this integration, who radiate this strength. But the world will actively discourage you from doing it because strong men are dangerous to systems built on control. Your job is to do it anyway. Now here's what I need from you. Write in the comments, "Solitude is my strength." 4 words that signal you understand what Jung was teaching, that you're ready to stop fearing alone time and start using it as the forge it actually is, that you're committed to developing the 8 sources of power that only emerge in isolation. The men who write those 4 words are the ones who will actually do this work, who will prioritize solitude even when society questions it, who will emerge from isolation carrying strength that others can feel but can't explain. Write it now. Solitude is my strength. Let's build a community of men who understand that being comfortable alone is the foundation of being powerful together. Hit that subscribe button because you're going to need ongoing reminders of this truth. You're going to need content that reinforces the value of solitude when everyone around you is pushing connection. You're going to need a voice that tells you choosing time alone is choosing strength, not weakness. Smash that like button if Jung's 8 reasons resonated somewhere deep. If you felt something inside you recognize that solitude isn't the problem. It's been the missing piece all along. The next video is going to take what you learned today and make it practical. We're diving into the exact practices Jung used during his 6 years of intensive solitude, the specific techniques for shadow integration, the precise methods for activating the transcendent function, the concrete steps for developing relationship with yourself. Everything today was about why solitude creates strength. Everything coming next is about how to actually use solitude to forge that strength in your own life. The information coming will give you the map Jung created, the tools he developed, the warnings he issued about what can go wrong when you descend into your own depths without proper preparation. This is not just philosophy anymore. This becomes your actual training program for becoming the integrated, powerful, sovereign man Jung described. Everything changes after the next video.